unless we get this structural reform, we're always going to have this torment of powerlessness.
I do really think resilience is a muscle, and if you work it, it gets stronger, and I gave that muscle a fairly good workout.
The fundamental basis of this shift begins with people with disability being recognised as rights bearers, not passive recipients of care and protection.
Good evening and welcome to On Creativity, presented by the UNSW Centre for Ideas and the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture. My name is Sarah Dingle and I'd like to welcome you all tuning in tonight. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Bidjigal and Gadigal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. So, what is creativity? And particularly at a time where we're all far too used to being stuck at home, staring at four walls, why is it so important? How can we make our lives more creative? And how can we use creativity to make our lives better? Tonight, we're going to hear from author, critic and feminist Jessie Tu, teacher, education activist and play advocate Pasi Sahlberg, and artist, filmmaker and innovator Lynette Wallworth.
I think we could start by letting people know it's not limited to childhood, and that it's available to everyone, and that it can be practiced and honed. And if we know that, perhaps then all of us can begin to access it.
We can change education by understanding that play is one of the most natural ways to advance creativity among children. What the schools can do is to stay aside and just let the children play. They know exactly what to do. It's their natural way of living. Just let the children play.
To me, it's really a question of politics and power when it comes to creativity. Who gets to exercise this act of creating something? And more importantly, who has access to it? Who gives creativity, who takes it, who demands it, who wants it, who benefits from it, and who is totally sidelined and ignored when it comes to attempting to practice it.
It's great to be here with Lynette Wallworth. She's an Emmy-winning artist and filmmaker who consistently works with emerging media technologies. Lynette's work has been shown at venues from the World Economic Forum in Davos to the Smithsonian, as well as film festivals, including Sundance, Tribeca Film Festival, and festivals here in Australia. Lynette is also a UNSW alumna. Lynette, what do you think creativity is and how does it work?
I think creativity is the capacity to imagine something that hasn't existed before. So to bring something into being, I guess that's what I think creativity is. It's highly linked to the process of imagination.
And did you think you were a creative child? Was creativity something valued in the environment in which you grew up?
Oh, that's interesting. I was an unsettled child. And so creativity was a way for me to sort of utilize or express a kind of energetic overload. And so my mum was really great about that, I must say. She gave me the opportunity to think about things in a way that stimulated my imagination. So like the simplest thing, lying down on the ground watching clouds, sort of formless things take shape, and asking me what I was seeing in those clouds. It's like that provocation, to find pattern where there may not be pattern, to find in your mind something that isn't clear. That was, I think, the starting ground for me. And the other thing, interestingly, was that my grandmother worked in a cinema in a country town, and she worked as a cleaner. She would go in and take us in at the end of these sessions to watch the endings of films. So you can imagine what that was like, to sort of see the last 5 or 10 minutes of a feature film, and then to have to imagine what was the story that brought us to that point. And at the time, I think it was, it was a strange, experience, but it was like highly imaginatively powerful, because it meant I had to think something up that I hadn't seen.
Have you ever gone back as an adult and actually watched those films to find out what the story was, or just hung on to what you had because it could not possibly be better than that?
You know, the one that impacted me the most was 2001: A Space Odyssey. And yes, I have watched that. But if you can imagine seeing the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey with no context. But
how did we get here?
Sarah, I can tell you, it's like that thing which creativity does, is that whether there's a new synaptic connection made, and you actually almost can feel it in your mind. Like you feel something fusing that wasn't there before. And I can remember that sensation of being in that cinema and seeing images, and my mind sort of springing to kind of leaps of imagination. And that sensation is, it's captivating.
It sounds almost visceral in you.
I think it. No, I do think it's visceral, and actually, for me, it's visceral. So think about, and we can get attuned to what that feeling is. So think about the first time you've tried a new technology. That's probably a really great way of thinking about it, because as we develop technologies, they change us. They kind of enliven things. They move parts together that weren't there previously. So if you think about the first time you experienced, I don't know, a VR headset, there's this like spark that's happening because your mind doesn't quite yet know what's going on and is trying to work out what's going on before that thing becomes usual. And that point, before something becomes usual, that is the spark of creativity.
Do you think your view of creativity has changed as you've moved from childhood into adulthood and become an artist throughout your career, or has it always remained that same idea that you had?
Oh, no, I think it's changed. I mean, I think I value it a lot more than I did. I think there's an interest. I think we devalue imagination and creativity actually in childhood. I think we think it's a given for all children. And there's a strange, maybe Western expectation that creativity will diminish in relation to other skills that we master, and that we diminish its power and its importance. And I honestly probably believed that when I was younger, and I think that I thought my capacities were less valuable than people who could, were really adept at science or maths, or the things that I was not so capable of. But as I've moved on in my life, what I see now is that without the possibility of imagining, we cannot change our future. Because unless we have the capacity to contemplate and imagine, and also sort of bring into mind a different scenario, we cannot change where we are now. And so I've come to a different position where I think the power of imagination is amongst the most important things to engender and encourage and hold on to.
We're doing this at a time, of course, when a lot of people are feeling completely tapped out because of the lockdown and the pandemic that we're currently facing. Do you have a particular artist or works that you like to read, consume, listen to, tap into to make you feel more energized creatively? Someone who's built another world, perhaps.
I mean, one of my most favorite artists is James Terrell, and it's very hard to tap into a James Terrell work sitting here, except in my mind, to go in my mind to the things I've seen of his, because Terrell works mostly with light, but that contemplation of light. So it's like there's no other content in a way. There's just the contemplation of light, which actually for him comes from a spiritual tradition that he was raised up in. And I have found that, I find that those works are incredibly expansive. And, but we can do our own versions of those. So I'm a great believer in the practice of heightened aloneness and in service to imagination, actually. And so for me, to go into my mind and relive the experience of being in a James Terrell work is a practice that I engage in, just as I do when I'm making a work, where I will come home from like hours and hours and hours of being around the technology that I'm using to try and build a work. And then in the evening, I'll sit in quiet and just imagine myself moving through the work in my mind. So then I'm sort of holding it inside myself. And that capacity to kind of contemplate, move through something, envision it, feel it, hold on to it, and then possibly solve problems via that means. That's something I practice. And I think that sitting just in the space of light and contemplation is helpful towards that.
Wow. Well, when we think about creativity and being creative in our current society, there is a view of creativity as something that belongs to the special few, and it comes out in artistic activity by those special few. What do you think of that? Is creativity something for everyone?
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course, absolutely, but maybe not. I'm not saying that everyone has the same capacity, but I am saying everyone has capacity. And part of the way we could think about it is, how do I intensify my capacity to be creative? And I think the way to do that is by focusing on your own individuality, because there's a really strong link between the individual thinking, the way I think that no one else may think. And so that kind of pushing of our own selves is very linked, I think, to the power of creativity. So anything that takes us away from, I guess, following in the footsteps of someone else, that any kind of group think, and that moves us towards just our own puzzling, thoughtfulness, contemplation, and then sort of a solving of something that's intriguing to our minds, that individualistic thought, that will hone your creativity.
How do you get your students to be more creative? Bearing in mind that creativity is quite hard to teach, how do you bring that out in a person?
So, I mean, I don't teach all the time, but occasionally I do. And I have done workshops where, especially with people, students working with technology, wanting to make something, and, but coming into those classes laden with screens. So if you take the opposite of what I was saying before about the capacity to be within your own mind and your own thoughts, So expanding the capacity of your own thinking. So when students come into a workshop that I'm giving and they're obsessively looking at their phones or otherwise looking at their laptop whilst talking, for me, I'm missing something that I'm trying to encourage in them. And so I have traditionally set as a requirement that people close every screen. And for the first 20 minutes of a workshop like that, we all close our eyes and sit in an imaginative space where we're walking through the works that we're hoping to make. And I sort of set that as a requirement because one, I think it's incredibly helpful. And two, I think today it's not a practice necessarily, but it's something that once you begin to see how it enlivens what you're able to imagine, it becomes very quickly something that you want to experience over and over again. And, you know, the shorthand of that is to say to a student, why should I help you make this work if you can't yet imagine what it is?
What kind of responses do you get to that question?
You know what? Like, honestly, in the beginning, it's a little bit rough and people are not necessarily happy, Sarah. And I really understand that because of this strong link between the ability to be inside your own thoughts and contemplate without being informed by a lot of, let's say, exterior stimulation. That capacity, that is where creativity is engendered. And so that's what I'm trying to encourage. I think once people get the hang of it, and I've seen that, they start to love it. But yeah, there's a bit of grit at the beginning. It often ends up well, though.
Well, we do have a related audience question from Wendy in Sydney. She asks, how has living so much of our lives online changed our creative responses or expression? So not just pure screen addiction, but how is it changing the output?
I think we're in a midway point at the moment. I think we all dove headfirst into these kind of conversations, which is Zoom, where I can see you, you can see me, I can hear you. I would encourage people to think about how it feels when you can't see a person, you can just hear them. Again, to the point of imagination being a keystone of creativity. If you remove one of the inputs to the senses, you automatically enliven imagination. So if we couldn't see one another, Sarah, I'm suggesting there be levels of our conversation that would emerge that don't emerge because we can see one another. And I think that part of what we have to get to is the place of understanding how we restrict or we become more elegant, more in our decisions about what we're using in terms of technology, because having online presence all the time doesn't necessarily lead to more. Sometimes it leads to less. I think the kind of capacity for just listening often creates intimacy, and I think we've got to get better at those sort of decisions. The technology we have now, and I work in that technology, allows for incredible immersive experiences, and they are profound, but they're not necessarily what we need all of the time. Sometimes what we need is for pieces of that input to be taken away so that we can engage more creatively in the conversations.
If someone wanted to cultivate their own creativity during this time of lockdowns, what would you recommend?
I mean, be like James Terrell, look at the sky, lay down on your back, watch the sky. See what happens when you contemplate something that there's no form to, or there's no, which is not, there's no, maybe, I mean, I guess I'm trying to say something about a puzzle.
See the pattern where there is no pattern.
Yeah, look for the pattern. Look for the pattern. It's why mathematicians and musicians are so closely aligned. It's not just the people who can do maths, it's the mathematicians. It's not just the people who can play music, it's the composers. It's the capacity to create pattern and to find the delight in that is really one of the keys. And you feel this, and you talked about the visceral. There's this like delightful sensation when you find that pattern that was like not apparent to you an hour ago. And that comes from a leap of imagination. Often it comes when you feel in a corner. So in terms of making a work, for me, it happens when I'm working with a technology that should be able to do something. I've been told it's capable. Maybe it hasn't been done before, but it's possible, should be possible. And I'm building a work and then I'm stuck. There's like a point where it feels like I can't get any further. That moment when you're pushing against what feels like an edge, your mind is taken to a place where if you let it, it will make the leap for you to a place that no one has mentioned before because they haven't been there before. And when you have that sensation, it's so satisfying. It's so wonderful. It's like you're in a whole new landscape. And so that comes from a way of thinking. So I really encourage people to, whatever you can do to hone your lateral thinking, is kind of give yourself challenges that feel impossible, because creativity is the thing that sits on the edge of what's possible.
We look forward to taking the leap. Lynette, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Good to talk. See you.
It's great to be here with Jessie Tu. Jessie's debut novel, A Lonely Girl is a Dangerous Thing, won the 2020 ABIA Award for the Literary Fiction Book of the Year. She's trained as a classical violinist and completed her Bachelor of Music Education in 2010 with UNSW. In 2021, she was awarded the UNSW Young Alumni Award. Jessie, what do you think creativity is, and how does it work?
I think it's really a question of risk-taking and the way in which in your own life you come across this idea of what it means to take a risk. So that can be like a risk in your personal life or in the way in which you do your job or in all other facets in your life. Creativity is, I think, sort of, it's not exactly a muscle. It's, for me, it's more closely aligned to this idea of power and the questions of who is allowed that power, who benefits from that power, who creates that power, who has the agency to practice that power is all quite political. So when I think about creativity, I actually think of it more in terms of a politics of power. And because for me, in my opinion, I think that creativity and the arts in general is a very political institution. It's a very political act. And so when I think about creativity, I really think about how it is that you practice your whatever measures of power that you enact in your life.
There is a view of creativity as something that belongs to the special few, and it comes out in artistic activity only. Is creativity something for everyone, or are only certain people the creatives?
I think creativity is for everyone. However, everyone's idea of creativity is different. And the way in which we practice that creativity is very much dependent on the way in which you approach this idea of, I guess, processes. So like someone might think that on paper, an artist is more creative than, say, a surgeon or a lawyer, like a corporate lawyer, right? But I think that in every aspect of your life, no matter what you do, creativity really means, in my opinion, approaching a problem or an issue or whatever thing you're facing in a way in which not a lot of precedence has occurred. So like if you're if you're creative in your field as a corporate lawyer, you're looking for other ways that are not typical or historically mandated to solve a problem. So this idea of creativity is very much like however you can think about different ways of thinking.
And who gets to do that?
That's such a great question. Who gets to practice this idea, this activity, this exercise in doing something in a way that is not common? I think it really depends on, it's such a hard question. It's really those people who have the ability, be it, the financial ability or the means in which to actually take a risk to do something differently. So like if you are someone who doesn't hold a lot of institutional or social or political power in whatever field that you work in, then you are, or like you are more vulnerable to the structures of, the corporate system that you work within, then you're less likely to be able to exercise creativity.
Historically, white people have held all the power in Australia. Are we seeing an expansion of creativity amongst non-white Australians, or is it still quite restricted in who gets to think differently, break the mold, take risks?
I think it's a little bit of both. It is definitely, I'm seeing changing, because a lot of the people who have historically been marginalized have been more vocal about not complying and not being sidelined, which I think is only a very good thing. In the last decade alone, a lot has changed within my own industry of literature and writing and practicing storytelling. However, in saying that, most of the people who do hold, most of the gatekeepers, I should say, I suppose, in the publishing world still remain predominantly from a specific race, a specific class, and therefore a very narrow and specific type of world experience or world view. And I think until that changes, until like we get more people of color, more people with like who are not neurologically typical, then only then will we see like more substantial and systemic changes.
You yourself are a critic for 9 newspapers, and this was part of a deliberate shift to get literary criticism away from an all-white space. Even if there are non-white people being creative, is our society always set up to receive what they make?
How do you mean receive?
Is our society always set up to recognise what they are doing and to incorporate it?
I'd say it differs with every different kind of branch of the arts, or or whatever, like political streams, or in education or in the law. It varies. I know myself that and these shifts occur, I think, quite frequently. So we can celebrate, milestones in terms of, good achievements in women getting leadership roles in publishing houses, for instance. But I wonder, like, the more important questions are, does that shift in power at the top trickle down to having stories that are not historically been lifted up or given a platform? If those stories are heralded and given the adulation and the attention and the sort of the degree of attention that that white, I guess, heteronormative people have historically been given.
I want to talk about you for a second. Did you think you were a creative child, and was creativity valued when you grew up?
I think I was creative in the sense that I was always, I think creativity, when I think about it, I think actually it just means seeing something and not being happy with what is in front of you and wanting to change that. So creativity is like trying, for me, it feels like it's seeing the world as it is in whatever iteration and thinking, I don't really like what I'm seeing, so therefore I'm going to try and change things by doing something. So like, for instance, it could be as small as like, as a child, your 5-year-old, you give them a palette of 5 standard colors, and then that child comes to you and says, I don't like any of those colors. And so they think, okay, how am I going to make up a color, or how do I change this reality? And so I think a creative child, I'm not sure if I did this myself, but a creative child would take a couple of those colors and try and make something new from it. I'd say myself personally, creativity, like in a lot of immigrant families, and this is obviously a very vast generalization, it's not something that is actively encouraged or like pushed by the parents, because like I said before, creativity is a matter of risk and who gets to risk take. And a lot of these parents who come from migrant backgrounds and from these other backgrounds have been, like many of them escape war, many of them escape poverty. And when they come into a new country, all they really want for their child is stability. And stability in a way is very counterintuitive, or the actual reverse of being creative. And so like, if you want your child to be like financially stable, then you won't really care whether or not they're very good artists or they're very good musicians, because artists and musicians have, tended to not be financially stable.
You did an abrupt about-face in terms of your own creative output when you left classical music and you moved into the author space. Was that scary?
I don't think I consciously thought of it being frightening. I think I'd say the only scary thing about it was not really knowing whether or not I would be able to financially support myself. So I think that like the physical issue, apart, like the financial side of shifting in terms of your career, was the only frightening thing. Other than that, I think that because I've learned from my dad that you need to be very audacious if you want to. Like my dad was like always very much, and he continues to be someone who's like espouses the idea that you should never be afraid of biting off more than you can chew. And I've actually throughout the last 2-3 years discovered that as a woman, maybe even as a woman of color, there are quite painful consequences of this. But for doing this, for biting off more than you can chew, like you get people criticizing you. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Like ambition is a very ugly thing. And even though it hurts me and it continues to wound me, I think I'm just strengthened by the fact that a lot of women throughout history who have ever done anything like out of the blue, like outside of the norm, have always been criticized. And so I try and just accept that, and then just accept the fact that no matter what you do, you're not going to be everyone's cup of tea,
In your book, which is amazing, by the way, there is a heartbreaking moment where a particular character, Val, has to choose to do something very ugly, which she does not personally want to do in order to further her own ambition. Do you think that still happens in the arts, for women in the arts, particularly women of colour, that they have to in some way do something very ugly in order to get ahead?
I think in a way, in order to get ahead in any field, and maybe I'm sure someone might disagree with this because I think it's still a working thought in my head, but I think ugliness exists if you are someone who's very ambitious and someone who wants to be at the top of your field. You have to be very, very ruthless. It doesn't mean like you have to do something ugly to others, but you might have to betray some sort of, not dignity, but betray something inside of you that wants to be soft and sweet and tender. And again, I think I'm sure that after I go away and think about this answer, I might think differently. But at the moment, I think I'm absolutely sure that not just women of color in the arts, but in all areas in society, there are still women, there are still people who are outside of the privileged status of, you know, whatever hierarchy that they, you know, outside of the highest hierarchy that they find themselves in. There are still people who need to compromise themselves in a way that in order to get what they want.
Well, we have an audience question from Cassie Ashford in Sydney. She asks, as a well-practiced procrastinator, what's the first step you take when you formed a great idea and you want to start making it a reality?
I think that the first step you take is really talking to yourself and actively saying that you should sit down and do whatever it is you want to do and not judge what's on the page. So if you're painting, or if you're writing, or if you're dancing, whatever it is, whatever you want to create, you don't have to know what it is, as long as you sit down and start doing something about it. Like, you don't have to know the direction, as long as you're like taking a step towards achieving some sort of creative outcome, and then deciding not to judge that at the end of the day. I think it's the most useful thing. Like, for me personally, often people ask me, like, because I write a lot every day, and a lot of people say, how do you do that? Well, it's just, like what I write ends up being, a lot of it ends up being very, very bad writing, but that doesn't matter. Like, it's the fact that I sat down and wrote and didn't judge what was on the page. That is what I found very useful, like just not giving into your self-critic.
And is that your number one strategy to foster creativity overall, would you say? Or do you have other like tips?
Absolutely. I'd say that was the most important thing that I have kept in the front of my mind when I write. It's this, because I think, because I still think women to this day, and this is like such an awful reality, but women are still held to different kind of levels of self-love, I suppose. Like, I think boys and girls grow up receiving different messages, and I think that girls continue to receive messages where they feel like they have to acquiesce in order to be likable. And like, being likable is such an important thing that we teach young girls, and that just never, it starts as a kid, you know, and as a young girl, and then it just never leaves you. As a young woman entering, you know, say a law firm when they're 21, like, they're measured on how sweet and likable and compliant and obedient they are, right? And so it's hard, and I think that all those traits that we learn in society are then transferred to our own personal relationships. And so, like, I see a lot of feminist women still end up sort of doing more like housework or cooking in the house, like in heterosexual relationships. It's just all these things we learn that is so, like, it takes women decades to let go of. And I'm always like, I was just telling my partner the other day, I'm always super distraught when I hear about like women in their 60s or 70s saying how it was only in their 60s and 70s that they found like self-acceptance and self-love. And I was like, oh my God, I have to wait until like I'm 60 to find, it's so distressing to hear that. But so I think especially for women, my message would be just try, and your number one most important step to take as a creative female artist is to not listen to the critic that says this is not good enough, because all those people historically who have said this is good and this is not have always been white men, and they're not used to extending their empathy to anyone other than someone who looks like them, you know.
I should say at this point, you know, we've got an Asian woman interviewing an Asian woman, and the last time that happened was probably, I don't know, on MasterChef or something. So, thanks, UNSW. In your book, again, the heroine finds her creative community, her people in New York. And I know New York has been a big part of your life. Do Australians still have to leave the country to fulfill their creative potential, do you think? Or is that changing?
I think absolutely, in a way, there are things as a creative person that you will not find in Australia that is absolutely so mind and life-changing for you to experience as a creative person overseas. I have no qualms in saying that. However, in saying that, there are things that are changing within Australia and communities being built that are very different to, say, even 20, 30 years ago. So even though I say, yes, in a way, like for musicians, like I think of all the classical musicians in Australia who have ever practiced, I think all of them have at least spent a few years in Europe or America training or studying, going to Juilliard or whatever, and artists as well. The sort of plethora of the creative history elsewhere is just really immeasurable. And like, I don't say that to bag out my own country. It's just Australia's, just in terms of timeline, Australia is quite youthful, compared to other countries. And so, yes, I'd say depressingly, there is that if you are creative, you really do need to at least try and find something elsewhere. It's not, I hope this doesn't sound like anti-Australian. It's actually just like, it's more like me promoting the fact that you should try and go elsewhere outside of your village, I suppose, so to speak, to find that your own, like to find other voices, to find other stories. Like I know myself, I've found a lot of validation going to America as an Asian, and like discovering what it means to be an Asian only actually when I leave Australia, which is very it's an interesting thing that I think a lot of creative people have experienced.
That's fascinating. Is that because you found more community amongst Asian Americans, or is it because you could, I don't know, perhaps see yourself more clearly when you were away from Australia?
I actually have to say, I think in attempting to clarify that, and I think both your suggestions, there's an element of truth in both of them. I think it's actually whenever I'm in, say, New York, especially, because I'm not going to, like, I'll say specifically in New York is where a lot of my cultural education has happened, because I won't, sort of lie to myself in saying New York is America or America is New York. New York is a very small part of America. But it's only in New York where I've actually been treated like someone who is not, and like they don't really, I know it doesn't seem like a real thing, but like they don't see my face and think, oh, she's an Asian. Like I feel like when I'm in Sydney, I'm often just immediately boxed. Like I have this, it's like people just like see my face and there's a code in which they think, oh, she must be, submissive, docile, whatever, because she looks Asian. But like, I don't get that when I'm in New York. I feel like people just listen to what I have to say and treat me like, just like, they're not as, I guess, cognizant of trying to fit me into a box, I suppose. So that has allowed me a lot of freedom to actually just listen and be myself in a way where I feel like a lot of the interactions in Australia have me been trying to appease people or like actively try and perform an identity where I am not docile or sweet or, compliant.
How has your view of creativity changed as you've grown into a career as an artist in Australia, overseas, wherever it may be? Have you changed your view of creativity itself?
I think I have. I think my idea about what creativity means has shifted more towards this idea of uncertainty, because like when you're creative, you're doing something that hasn't been done before, right? And so it's uncomfortable. I think it's uncomfortable to sit with uncertainty. And in this world, I think it's natural for a human being to not want to reduce or have the least a sort of least amount of time feeling discomfort. Like we do stuff in our lives, in our personal, professional lives, to make sure that we stamp down the discomfort of uncertainty, right? But creativity is all about being uncertain, because you are embarking on a journey, like you're embarking on a path in which like the track has not been caved, I suppose. I mean, what's the term for like tracks being made? Yeah, like tracks being enacted. And so when I think of creativity now, I think of like, if someone comes to me and says, how do you be creative? My question back to them would be, how comfortable are you with being uncomfortable?
What a great answer. Thank you so much, Jessie Tu. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thanks, Sarah. It's been lovely to speak to you too.
It's great to be here with Pasi Sahlberg. Pasi has worked as a teacher, educator and policymaker in Finland, and he's advised education leaders around the world. He's Professor of Education Policy at UNSW Sydney and the Deputy Director Research of UNSW's Gonski Institute for Education. He's also the author of many books, including Finnish Lessons, What Can the World Learn from Educational Change in Finland? And his most recent books include Let the Children Play, How More Play Will Save Our Schools and Help Children Thrive. First of all, Pasi, what do you think creativity is? How does it work?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Good to be with you here. Creativity is one of those concepts that people don't have a common universal aspect. For me, creativity is simply to put your curiosity and imagination in action. So I see the linkage between your power of imagining things and being curious about things, and then creativity is something that I do when I use my imagination and curiosity to do something, create some new ideas. So that's how I see creativity.
Let's get a bit personal for a second. You grew up on a remote farm in Finland. Did you think you were a creative child, and was creativity something fostered when you grew up?
If I compare to the lives of my two children here in Sydney, having a city life, really urban living, to what I had myself in a small village in northern Finland, I must say that that environment was extremely creative, in a sense that there's a lot of nature and very little kind of a man-made things for you to play with or do. So everything we did as children, we had to create kind of a design and build ourselves. I didn't understand that time. Actually, I often dreamed of having a little bit more around me, and my city urban friends and relatives kind of envied the things that they didn't need to do or think about, just use them. But afterwards, now when I think about my childhood, I understand that was actually extremely rich and great place to grow up within, all these things that enabled many things to happen and kind of invited me to be creative and design things for myself.
And that sort of richly creative environment, was that by design or was it more by accident? Was it just the culture of the time that children were let loose?
It was definitely by the design of the culture and the time. This was a very rural setting where I was growing up, and there's basically the nature was the only thing that was around there.
Mm. Now, in adulthood in particular, there's a view of creativity as something that belongs to the special few, the elites, and that it is expressed purely in artistic endeavour. What do you think of that? Is creativity something for everyone, or does it only happen in certain settings?
No, I think it's a great myth to believe that creativity would be only for some people, or let alone that only some people would be creative. I think this has been enforced by partly by our cultures these days, but also education that is rewarding those who are able to by their own natural talents to do more music or paint or act or be creative, and those who are not. And I think that this is one of those things that our education systems should do much better, is to not try to categorize people to those who are creative and those who are not. We are all born in a ways that we have the same types of abilities. We have the same potential, to create and be creative. But we just like Sir Ken Robinson said, that we are growing out of this creativity, and school systems are just doing more of that. And that's one of those things I really would like to see being changed.
Well, your book, Let the Children Play, stresses that creativity is universal in young children. But as we grow up, it seems to get shut down, increasingly shut down. And now we are in a time where children are literally shut down. We are going through extensive lockdowns in many states across Australia. How worried are you by the threat posed by lockdown to play and to creativity, particularly in children?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sarah, because my thinking is divided. In one ways, I'm extremely worried about the play deprivation during the lockdown and this pandemic. Particularly when we live through the times when the playgrounds are closed and children cannot go to school, and the families are staying indoors, without resources to do that. But at the same time, this lockdown has also shown to be quite special time in the sense that, when there's much less things for people to do, because of the work has been disrupted, and also schools have been kind of in a standstill to use their creativity and imagination and start to play. I'm not sure, Sarah, how this all is going to play out. I think that we're going to see a lot of children that actually have been deprived because of the shortage of opportunities to play. But I'm sure that we're going to also see a lot of families, and we're going to see a lot of children who have been able to thrive because of this time. The kids have much more time to play with themselves. And that's why I think it's been very important for parents to understand the power of play and the fact that, if your children are not learning all the time using their online gadgets and devices, that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're doing something good, and play is one of those good things that they could do.
Well, this is it. There's a real tension between the notion of creativity and anything that comes on a screen, basically. And in lockdown, parents are torn between doing their own work, educating their children, and it's really easy to hand kids a screen. But on the other hand, schools are also using screens to connect with their students. So is this pandemic rewriting screen rules for children?
I hope it's not, because, even before pandemic, the amount of time that children and young people spent on screens was through the roof. And what this pandemic, just like you said, has done is to just amplify that kind of inactive time that kids have. I hope that what this pandemic will actually do is to help us to rethink both in the school, the role of technology and the screens. I think it's a great kind of enabling tool for us, but particularly at homes, that how should we spend time when we are at home? And you're absolutely right, Sarah, that it's so easy to just hand over your smartphone or devices to kids and keep them quiet, and so that you can concentrate on your work or preparing a dinner. But I think that my own research and research of my colleagues around the world is indicating the same thing, that we are having very serious issues right now with the well-being and declining physical health and many other things because of this increased time that we are spending with these devices. But I tend to think positively and believe in the kind of a power of people's judgment and understanding and consideration with these things, that we will come stronger and healthier out of this pandemic.
Well, thinking positively then, how should parents approach screen time in lockdown? Do you have any tips or advice? Is there a good way through this, somewhere we can all feel a bit less guilty, use this as an opportunity to foster creativity?
Yeah, I think first of all the parents should not feel guilty. I think we're all in this situation together. We have two young children here, and I know exactly what it is. when going gets tough and you have to do your work and the kids have to do their own homework and entertain themselves. They cannot go out and see their friends. So this is a very special time. But I think, there are some things that we can do. One of them is, of course, that we should all try to, follow the same rules as parents and children, that we should try to avoid things that kids would kind of understand that this is only for them. And then the parents can do whatever they want to do with their devices or social media or TV or those things. That let's make sure that these rules and new regulations are same for everyone. And then the other one,
get a screen, you don't get a screen, basically.
Yeah, and then the other simple thing that I've been advocating in my book and in many of the community meetings that I have had with parents and schools is to simply turn off your devices and go and play. If you're going to go out to the park or playground, play indoors. And it can be a very empowering and a new experience for many parents as well, and grandparents, whoever happens to be around, to play with your own children. And that's probably the best way also to realize this kind of a creative nature of all types of different plays and how easily children get into this mode of imagining things and, being curious about things that you never thought about them being curious. So I think that this time is also a good chance for us parents to, just let go a little bit our adult lives and sit down with our kids and play with them. That doesn't cost anything, and that can have a really hugely beneficial outcomes later on.
Is it also how we will look back on this time? Is that a good yardstick to think about?
I think it will be. I've met many people, and I'm one of them who is I'm ashamed to admit that there's so many good things with this pandemic that has happened to me personally as a father and husband as well. That I'm sure that I am going to look at this pandemic on one hand as a kind of a very painful, difficult, complicated period of time, but also I'm going to see this as a time when I really have to stop, my crazy, busy life of, flying around the world and doing like 3 things simultaneously, as something where I have to sit down and look around and really see the value that I have in my children and family, and learning new things at home. That's again where the creativity steps into the picture. That I've learned to cook during these 18 months, and cooking is an extremely creative thing. As soon as you stay, you have to pass the kind of a certain threshold of looking at the recipe book all the time. But when you realize kind of how the meals and how different dishes are prepared and created, it's been a wonderful thing for me to realize that how creative cooking actually can be. And I'm sure that I'm not alone with this thing, that there are many parents and adults who realize that, I learned to play an instrument, I learned another foreign language, I learned to know my children and my spouse a little bit better during these 2 years or 3 years. God knows how long this is going to go. But, creativity anyway will be a very important chapter in this book of, life in the pandemic, when we will be writing that a little bit later. Not now, but for a few years to come.
So we have an audience question here from Beverly Veazey in Sydney, particularly about adults. She says, play and adults can help foster new ideas and approaches to some of the world's most complex challenges, like cooking. What can we do to foster this approach to thinking in workplaces?
A great question. And I think, many workplaces actually has been shifting to this direction. If you visit any of these high-tech or edutech companies and see what they do, where they have to kind of create new ideas and imagine new things and reimagine issues, that they are very playful places already. And I think that that's what we're going to see in the future as well. I've been advocating a lot, particularly high school principals and teachers, to think about their workplace with a new eyes now, and just walk around your school as a workplace and ask yourself that how playful environment is this? How much our workplace is inviting us to stop and play a little bit or use our imagination, or how many places there are that really triggers our curiosity to think about things in a new way. So this is happening. It will take a little bit time, and that's why it's so important, I think, that our education systems and our schools are providing more and more opportunities for all ages of our children to play and experience this wonderful power of imagination that we all have.
Can you actually teach creativity?
I don't think that you can teach creativity directly. This has been a question in education for many, many years. And I think that the common conclusion is that it's a very difficult to teach creativity. What we can do is to create conditions, provide students and children space to play, and even more importantly, make sure that students have time to play and create and develop these skills and attitudes and habits of minds that are needed in creativity. Teaching creativity is a difficult thing. So the best thing to do is to step aside and let the children play, because that's how the creativity triggers. And Sarah, one more thing here is that our young people and children have less and less time in their lives where they can truly feel that they are in control. And when you feel that you are free to do things, that you control your own thinking and behaviors, that's the space where creativity happens. That's when the curiosity and imagination come in, and those are the conditions for creativity. And just, if we ask ourselves that how often our children, let's take primary school children, how often do they have this feeling that I am in control? I can do, I can consider and choose what I want to do and how I'm going to do it. Not very often. The schools are fully scheduled for kids day in and day out. And when the children come home, their parents, telling them to do their homework or go to bed or do these things. So I think that we have kind of stolen away this opportunity from our children, many of them, to have this kind of a feeling that, I'm in control, not of course all the time, but, sometimes during the day. And that is the moment when this real opportunity for creativity to come in takes place.
Well, if we want to set those creative habits for life, schools have all their time scheduled out, as you just said, and a lot of that scheduling is driving towards NAPLAN, towards standardized testing. You've argued that NAPLAN is actually making schools less likely to fulfill their role as educators. If creativity is so important, should we abandon NAPLAN?
I think we should abandon NAPLAN as it is now and what it has become. It's the same story with all the standardized assessments around the world. When they were initially created, the initial idea was completely different, and it's often a kind of a good thing that many people can support. But it's almost always happens that these national assessments like NAPLAN, they turn out to be something that nobody wanted to be in the beginning, and this is what we are seeing a lot here in Australia. That NAPLAN is like the only yardstick that all the actions in teaching and learning is focusing on. So I'm not saying that we would abolish it altogether and have nothing. I think we need to, everybody understands that we need to have information, how the schools are doing and how the kids are learning, but there are different ways to do that. But I definitely think that, the time of this NAPLAN we have had here for the last 12, 13 years is over, and Australia and all Australian families and children, they deserve much better and much more kind of an intelligent and creative way of answering the same questions that, how are we doing in education in this country?
If we abandon NAPLAN and that's no longer the yardstick, how do we measure creativity in schools? How do we know when we're getting it right?
Another great question, Sarah. I think, I would actually challenge this question that do we always have to measure everything? If the measuring means that, we are having these assessments and say that, this is how creative this particular school is, or this is how creative this student or these students are. I think we have to let go a little bit of this need for measuring everything. I think we should think much harder about what would be the indications or indicators of, education being a kind of a creative space for children. Why not, for example, look at the real artifacts or kind of things that the schools are creating or putting forward, like, it could be a theater performance for the whole school, or it could be a arts exhibition, or it could be a kind of a scientific project where the students have invented or created something new. And I think, measuring things almost always, as I said earlier, leads to unintended practices and habits. And my fear is that if we would begin to measure creativity, many schools here and elsewhere would begin to teach creativity, make sure that, all the kids understand what creativity is, and then start to behave that way. And I'm not sure that this is the most creative way to do this whole thing. So I think, answering this question of how do we know that our education system and our schools are kind of advancing this curiosity, imagination, creativity among our children, requires much more creative ways to answer that question that we normally have. So yes, we should have information about that, but measuring it as we normally understand measurement, I would be very careful.
Challenge right up the chain. Thank you, Pasi Sahlberg, for having a chat today. It's been so interesting.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for joining me tonight for On Creativity, presented by the UNSW Centre for Ideas and the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture. What a great session. I am now personally more determined to take risks, play more, and now I'm also going to imagine my own alternative origin story for 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you would like to stay up to date with more events, please subscribe to the UNSW Centre for Ideas newsletter. Good night and stay safe.